The best way to start when you're building your logic model, usually in a group, is just with a very simple template, and you can use flip chart paper either on a wall or on a table for this. And I've just marked out a very simple grid which shows the template that we'll be adding items to. The first thing to think about is your rationale for your project, and it's helpful to have at least a working hypothesis to your model. You probably will want to include it on the final model, and you might want it at the top, or if you're reading left to right, you could have it to the left of the model. This gives the reason why you're wanting to make a change and sets up the if we do this, then we'll expect certain outcomes. Some logic models also have assumptions, and again you can include these at the bottom of the model, because this is where you can explain these things will happen as long as certain conditions are in place, such as the investment is going to continue, or leadership will be fairly consistent, or anything else about the external environment that could influence the project. It's almost always best to start with the end in mind when filling in the logic model. So you'll start with your outcomes. Working in a group, you'll want to come up with as many of the benefits for your model. So how will you know that changes that you're making are successful? What is it that you're trying to achieve at the end? You can split these into the things that you'll expect to see more immediately in the shorter term, and those things that are more your longer term impacts. So for example, changes in population health and well-being, whilst they might start straight away, the measurable changes may well be longer term impacts. Everything in this section tends to be expressed in terms of increases or decreases or improvements. So for example, you might immediately be working to make improvements in services or pathways, and similarly in clinical or care processes, targets and outcomes. And as those come to fruition, you'd be expecting to see changes in the effectiveness and the efficiency of the way the care is being delivered. And in the medium to longer term, seeing changes in the way that care is experienced, which could be by the users, carers, or the people working in the services themselves. And those people will have changes in their skill sets according to the changes in the services that are being designed. Also importantly, the ways of working across partnerships, ways of working together change, and the relationships across the system start to change. So in your model, you'll want to start to describe some of those expectations. More material changes that could happen longer term could be that you're expecting improvement in information communications or technology. Overall, if you're changing service infrastructure, leadership will be more integrated, more successful. And similarly to relationships, that there could be changes in the culture between organisations and partnerships. And as time goes on, particularly related to the experience that people have of their own care, that can help to nudge people's behaviours and lifestyle towards more healthier decisions and choices. With this template, there's normally 4 headings to get you your simple template: inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, which we've already covered. For the rest of the template, you can work program by program or project by project. So you would put on one program as an activity and then work through that program's outputs and the inputs required for it. Or you can just deal with it by putting the whole suite of programs and projects on in one time. And then you go through a similar process to generate your outputs. And this time you can reference back to your activity and what you're expecting to be the end product in each case. And these are normally expressed as products, which can be tangible products that are visible to the end user, but they can also be intangible outputs, and they may relate more to the processes you've already defined, in which case you would be talking about processes that have been completed or mobilised successfully. It can also be useful to relate back to your own programme methodology, and you might want to describe your output to align with your milestones and gateways, and not to forget that there will be key decisions and agreements to be made along the route, and that those form some of your important outputs for your change programme. Within the input section, again, you've now got key activities that you've already defined that will result in the outcome that you're looking for. So the inputs are the things that you will consume in doing your activities, and they're usually expressed in the form of investment with a financial value alongside that. And that can be broken down into further subheadings because you'll be using a mixture of investment types such as funding or shifts in funding. You will also want to think about people's time that will be going in, and again you can cost that, so the workforce time both in the planning of your change programme but also in the delivery of the change and the activities themselves. You'll also be consuming some materials and equipment in order to make your changes, particularly if you're working on something like a telehealth project. And similarly, inputs can include the places where the care is being delivered or piloted. Once you've got to this point, you can see you've got a very simple first draft of a logic model that's starting to look like a recognisable logic model. And at this point you can step back and look across the whole, and you'll start to be able to see natural groupings emerging. And usually that happens as you're populating the model and putting the items onto it. The next step then is to take this simple template and start to group together to show more of the linkages and the causality between particularly the outcomes and those activities and end products that contribute specifically to those outcomes. So for example, you could home in on experience as an outcome and decide which activities in particular are going to contribute to changing the way that the care is experienced. This first draft of a template uses the simple approach recommended by NHS England and gives you a foundation if you wanted to add further subcategories or headings. There are different types of logic model that you could look up in further research, but as you can see, this very quickly gets you to your first successful draft.